I've sort of become highly masochistic in my writing practice. Like I sort of informed the publishers. I made sure that the work had a home, the book had a home before I finished it, so that I was writing into a space and into a deadline. And I sort of gently told the publishers that they needed to tell me that, people would die, and my parents wouldn't love me anymore if I didn't finish. Like, it's got that bad.
Did they do that for you?
I got a really scary email on deadline day, which I think might have been real and not them just playing into it, but it said it's Monday or no book.
Hello and welcome to Collected, the podcast about writing from the Royal Literary Fund. I'm Julia Copus, a poet and a Royal Literary Fund Fellow. And in this series, we're mining the riches of the Royal Literary Fund audio archive with specially chosen guests. So we'll be listening in on other writers as they reflect on their experiences and creative processes. And the archive is a large bank of conversations and talks featuring a whole range of writers discussing the writing life, warts and all. So the highs and the lows, the good, the bad and the ugly. So today we're going to be joining that conversation, and I'm very excited to have with me today the poet and visual artist, Ella Frears. Ella's work has been described in The Guardian as fizzing with insistent energy, full of crystalline images and metaphors, and by Frank Skinner on his poetry podcast as exciting, a bit scary, and sort of brilliant. Her newest book, Good Lord, is a genre-bending book. It's written in verse, but in the form of a long email. And that email is addressed to an estate agent. I found it a really compelling read. And it's an investigation into our obsession, especially today with the whole notion of property, whether that's human or we're talking about houses and so on. So despite its genre-defying nature, it was very quickly snapped up by the poetry world and shortlisted for the prestigious Forward Poetry Prize for Best Collection. It's really fantastic to have you here, Ella. Welcome.
Thank you. Lovely to be here.
So, Ella, the hybrid text I think it's been enjoying a bit of a moment for a while recently. And Good Lord is written in the form of this long email, as we said. But it has a very intimate at times, tone. And there's a fair bit of anger, I think it would be fair to say, as well as humour in it. And other tones as well. It's one of the things I really admire about it. It's incredibly engaging, a page-turner, which is unusual in poetry, perhaps. But I'm wondering, is it a novel, a poem memoir, or something else? And even whether that matters. So hold on to that thought. And to help get us thinking about that idea, I thought we could start by listening to novelist Beth Miller talking about being genre fluid.
I didn't intend to be genre fluid. It was an accident. Genre is one of those things that you don't think about most of the time you're writing. You focus on the story and characters and your foolishly convoluted plot. But once the book is done, genre can sometimes be, for a brief and intense period, the most important thing there is. Particularly if you're trying to convince your publisher that this new book honestly isn't so very different from your previous ones. A few years ago, I attended a talk given by an illustrious writer. She was asked a question about genre and replied that it wasn't important. Certainly no agent or publisher was the least interested in it. This came as a surprise to some of us in the room who have been regularly tripped up by genre. I assume her opinion was as a result of being a writer of literary fiction, the default genre. It put me in mind of Donald Trump accusing Hillary Clinton during the 2016 election campaign of playing the gender card, seeming not to realise that he'd spent his entire life doing the same. When you're the default, you don't always realise you are also a category. The genre of my first book was clear: commercial women's fiction, whatever that is. But my second book seemed to be in a troublesomely different genre. On first seeing its rather creepy cover, My agent said, "Oh, the publisher did well to find a way to package it." It was hard to categorise, apparently, because it read like a psychological thriller, news to me, but without the final twist required of that genre. Plenty of reviewers subsequently complained about that missing twist, and no amount of me saying I hadn't intended to write a psychological thriller made anyone the least bit sorry for me. My third and fourth books were back in women's commercial, other than a brief flirtation with light-lit and uplit, two short-lived genres. My fourth was also classed on a certain large book website as women's divorce fiction, a niche genre which pleased me greatly. Genre niggles became a full-blown problem with my fifth book. My editor rejected it, saying that it wasn't a Beth Miller book, and it was no good me protesting that it must be because I'd written it. A Beth Miller book seemed to have become a specific genre of its own. Other publishers also turned it down, despite liking it, because it read like a rom-com without any rom. It was eventually published by a small independent press, whose editor's opening comment on the book was, "Bet you found this hard to place." My sixth and latest novel is by far the heaviest of my books, focusing on adoption, family breakdown and domestic abuse. There's not a laugh in it. But Amazon have listed it under humorous literary fiction. I'm starting to suspect that it's not the genre of my books which is fluid, so much as the very concept of genre itself.
So obviously Beth is talking there from the point of view of a novelist, and she's talking about divisions, within fiction. But is there anything in what she said that resonated for you? And how do you see your book in terms of genre?
Yeah, absolutely. When she begins and she says something like, I didn't mean to. I didn't mean to be genre fluid. Yeah, I think there's a luxury with being a poet. In a way, it's one of those art forms that where you don't need to sort of push it into genre necessarily, that it's just, there's one bookshelf in a bookshop called poetry and that's where stuff goes.
Can you imagine it being divided more finely than that? Yeah.
It would be the tiniest little bookends, little spaces for little books. Weighty, but little in thickness. Yeah. But yeah, and so I think that when I set out to write Good Lord, it hadn't really occurred to me that would be a problem. And, it's only my second book. The first book was a sort of straightforward collection of poems. But it began life as an actual email, a real life email to an estate agent. I was renewing my contract and got into this argument. Good Lord is the name of a real property technology.
I looked it up.
Yeah, it's quite sort of dystopian and I guess which was my problem, or what sort of induced a kind of fury, weird passive fury in me. But yeah, I sort of developed this voice in an actual argument with the estate agent. So I was amusing myself, being oddly floral, and then became interested in this idea of if I push this email into the fictional realm, as in it's no longer actually being sent, it's 220 pages, that would be illegal.
So did you, was there a point at which you did intend to send it?
I was sending odd emails to the estate agents. I realised it's a sort of void that you can chuck anything down and get a neutral response. And they had been awful, these estate agents, they were trying to put the rent up and things for nothing. And so I sort of felt in my rights to sort of fling Yeats quotes into their inbox.
How did that go down?
They didn't. Really.
They didn't pick them up?
No. Weeks later, once I'd stopped sending these emails, when I realised that actually creatively this was what was fulfilling me rather than what I was trying to write book-wise.
Amazing.
I stopped emailing them. I signed up to the thing I was refusing to sign up to, Good Lord. And I got an email from the estate agent weeks later saying, I just don't know what your problem is. So the Yeats quotes obviously did get through eventually. They sunk in. That's what poetry does.
Oh, that's wonderful. I like that. So one of Beth's conclusions there is that it isn't actually her books that are genre fluid, but the concept of a genre itself. But I suppose there's also the lyric essay, isn't there? Is that a poem? Is it an essay? Is it a poem in essay form? Do you have an opinion on that one? Because that's sort of gaining in popularity a bit.
Yeah, the lyric essay is great. I mean, you see stuff popping up, don't you, on Twitter occasionally, although less so these days now that it's ruined, where people say, what even is a lyric essay? That doesn't exist. It's either a poem or... it's never really mattered to me. There are things that you sacrifice when you're writing And I think some idea of what it's supposed to be should be sacrificed in order to make the work really good.
There's too much noise otherwise, isn't it?
Yeah, way too much. Or you sort of, I mean, obviously rules can help bend something into an interesting and sort of surprising shape. And so, you know, genre can help. Like if you decide to write a horror or whatever, or gothic, that can be really interesting to sort of play with those tropes. But in terms of when you've written something hybrid like a lyric essay, I don't need to know if it's poems or if it's essay. Or
I guess it's more, all these things are more of a problem for the publishers and how they present them, how they market them and so on.
And also readership, you know. I think one of the reasons that the publisher for my book is saying that it's a novel is that, I mean, it is kind of novelly in that it's got plot.
Yeah, it is,
Yeah. But also you get a much bigger readership.
Exactly,
Because people hear the word poetry, lots of people, and run a mile.
Yes, they do. Yeah. I always find that really embarrassing at the hairdressers.
Oh.
Someone says, what do you do? Are you honest then?
I am honest. Yeah. What do you say? Do you lie?
Well, I say I'm a writer. Yeah, which is true. It makes me laugh when you read, is a poet and a writer. Or, you know, I don't really understand that because poets are writers.
But that it's to cover bases so people don't, because people, And I understand there's a lot of reasons why poetry is a genre that people find difficult. And, you know, part of that has to do with school, part of that has to do with this idea that there's something that they're supposed to, some code that they're supposed to crack.
Difficult in some way,
Which we know isn't the sort of whole truth at all. Sometimes if I know I'm teaching a class where they don't know that it's going to be poetry, I ease them in. I won't mention the P word.
Sounds very wise. Yeah. And just finally on that, Beth was talking about a Beth Miller book. Is there such a thing as an Ella Frears book? And would you like there to be?
I hope that I am sort of developing some sort of voice or style, or that there are things that come through that are potentially mine. Or, but I think I'm too new. I think, you know, in 5 books' time, maybe I can look back and sort of start to identify what those things are. And this was really new for me because I'm writing in a voice that's less close to my own voice than I have previously. So,
I want to talk to you about voice. We'll do that in a bit. I think there is a strong voice actually that does bridge both your books. But as I said, we'll go on to that. But whatever your book might be classed as, Good Lord is written in verse, right?
Yeah.
And one of the things I really admire about your poetry is its exuberance and boldness. And as I said, there are lots of other tones there as well. And some of the books quite upsetting, but you manage to communicate it in a way that isn't sort of me, poor me vibe. But you're also a master of the well-turned line, and sort of you're very good at subverting readers' expectations. And rhythmically as well, your poetry is very sure-footed, I think. So to help get us thinking about some of the technical features of poetry, we're going to listen now to a voice that I think is familiar to both of us, Martina Evans, discussing with me the use of rhyme royal in They Flee From Me by Thomas Wyatt. And I should just say that we were very deep into the poem at this point, and I wanted specifically to know why Martina thought that Wyatt had chosen that particular, quite constricting rhyme scheme for this particular poem.
So why this very tight, very controlling rhyme scheme?
Yeah, I mean, who knows why he used it? I think Chaucer was widely admired at the time. But what it gives us is such a sense of entrapment in the poem, I think.
Yeah.
It's enhanced by this rhyme royal, which clicks into place at the end of the line like a handcuff.
I love that image, like a handcuff, yes.
Yeah, or a trap with a kerching. It's a very effective rhyming scheme, and it binds the whole together. And yet a line where, when her loose gown from her shoulder did fall, in the middle of the second stanza does not stop. It runs along into the next line with, and she me caught in her arms long and small. The way the line spills over into the next mimics that unstoppable fall of the material to the floor. And that's one of the joys of the poem. The flow and the rhythm change, but everything snaps back like a trap at the end of each line.
I love that he rhymes chamber and danger in the first stanza. Those two words, chamber and danger, really seem to set the tone for the whole thing.
And it reflects the idea of opposing forces. A chamber should be a safe place, but not when lovers are running around jumping into each other's beds. And what happened in Anne's chamber, conversations she had in her chamber with courtiers, directly led to her head being cut off.
So, quite a dramatic end to the clip there. But I'm really interested in how knowingly, if you like, you manipulate the line and make use of rhyme and meter and so on.
Yeah, I mean, it would be really impressive if I unknowingly wrote meter. Yeah, I love what Martina says about the handcuffs or the ka-ching.
Yeah.
And I think that that's exactly what like a metrical foot or meter can do if sort of employed in a surprising or interesting way.
Yeah.
In my work, I'd always used syllabic meter, but never sort of successfully written a poem using iambic pentameter, for example, because it didn't fit with my cadence, my natural sort of.
So you always write in syllabics?
Not always, but I liked syllabics.
So a certain number of syllables to the line, and do you have a preferred number of syllables?
I'm just trying to count one of my. Yeah, I like 5 really short lines. I have a poem about moss that seems to sort of be one of the poems that's caught readers, and that has a really strict, very short line. And I think one of the reasons that it sticks is because it's in syllabics. Whether people sort of notice that or not is not important. It's more that it has this sort of almost like a drum beat, this sort of counting.
They don't have to know why it's having that effect, but you're making that effect as the maker.
It's like sort of emotional mathematics or something. Yeah, and I'd always tried to use sort of really tight meter in my work, but it didn't fit. But then when I got to this book, I realized that I wanted the voice to sound kind of oddly unsettling, aloof, like she was sort of pressing some sort of cultural weight on someone who had the estate agent has power over her, has power over the place that she lives. But she has this sort of education, this cultural weight, even though class is sort of muddied in the book a bit. Yeah. And so suddenly I was able to write in sort of rough iambs, and it meant that I can, with that voice, I can fall into perfect iambic pentameter when she's being very sort of high and mighty. Yes. And again, whether that's noticed or not kind of doesn't matter, but it does create some sort of weird, archaic feeling. Yeah.
I mean, so I noticed it, but I think I noticed it because, well, first of all, I just noticed the beautiful rhythm. And then, what is she doing here? You know, what actually is she doing? And then I see the iambs, di-da, di-da, di-da. And did you use syllabics at all in that?
I wasn't counting. I was interested in terms of the line breaking that had more to do with this idea that we break lines in an email. And I know that that's not really what we're doing, but for clarity, you press enter more in an email than you would in another piece of prose. Yeah. And also there are things about the email that are closer to, well, I mean, it's lineage. Yeah. The email comes from phone conversations. It doesn't come from letter writing, even though you'd think that it does. And so there are things that are closer to sort of spoken word and phone calls and so I was breaking the line with that in mind rather than with the sort of a syllabic count. So both two things were going on. It was iambic, occasionally falling into really regular iambic pentameter, then some slightly rougher moments when her voice is slipping. Yeah. And then this email.
That's so interesting. It's really interesting. This sort of the background that is from phone calls rather than. And I guess we do that pressing return to break up this sort of, it would look like a very long, solid piece of text.
Yeah, and we want clarity. Yeah. And that's the thing. We use dashes a lot. Well, I'm speaking for myself, but in emails, like Emily Dickinson, you know? Yeah. But nowhere else do I see in corporate, so many dashes.
Yeah, yeah. That's true, isn't it? or exclamation marks?
Exclamation marks as well.
Yeah.
Although we're supposed to take those out, aren't we?
Are we?
I don't know. I got told it would make me sound more powerful.
Without
but I put them all in the book.
You've got rid of all your exclamation markitis.
Work life.
But I also thinking about, what a line break can do in poetry. I love that hiatus, the little gap at the end of the line that sort of forces you to pause before you read on to the next line, and the expectation that's set up. And then what you can do with that, you can reinforce what the reader's thinking or is probably thinking, or like you do, you can totally turn it on its head. And I actually, Ella, I have an example here that might be useful for listeners. So if anyone does have your book, it's page 75 of Good Lord. And the narrator's talking about a beach bonfire that she was at as a young woman. And she's sitting with a boy who's obsessed with a friend who has the same name as her. And here's the quotation. One night down at the beach, big bonfire, Smirnoff ice, he talked and talked to me about his love. And that sounds like he talked and talked to me about his love. Da, 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 da. So you say you don't write iambic pentameter, but then you've got your perfect line. Line break. He talked and talked to me about his love for her eyes and hair and beret, etc. That's just a random example, but it's brilliant, and it's something that can only be done in poetry. I don't know about you, but to me, it feels like a privilege to have those kind of tools to hand in poetry.
Yeah, I feel deeply passionate about the line break. I can't express my love for it.
I don't think I can either.
It really, really does it for me. In other people's work, when I'm writing, I really enjoy. I did spend hours just over single line breaks, and that sort of subtle movement and how it can change the meaning, and also jokes in inverted commas are better because of the line breaks. There are things that when the designer was typesetting it, I kept having to move things around so that the page wouldn't break across my line break. Oh God, yeah. Because it ruined the joke. And that's really hard to explain to someone if they've not sort of dealt in line breaks. Although a designer should sort of understand the sort of spatial.
Well, maybe you've educated them, because it's such a cool thing to have available to you. Yeah. And I think if people just understood that about poetry, it's quite exciting. Yeah. And then went back to a poem and, okay, so these line breaks are not random. What are they doing? Are they turning the meaning on its head? That's my favorite.
I completely
trick.
agree. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's sort of magic, and I've always felt them physically, even at school when I didn't have particularly good sort of school education, but when occasionally I'd meet a poem, I would feel that physical pull of the eye or breath or whatever it is. And yeah, I'm obsessed.
We're going to broaden out a little bit here and talk about the writing routine or your writing practice. Because particularly as a fellow poet, I'm very curious about that and about how you sustain your creativity. And of course, you're a visual artist too. So you've got lots to sustain. I read somewhere that after your first book, the very successful Shine Darling, that you experienced a bit of self-doubt or were worried about what might come next, which I think is very normal. And I'm definitely no stranger to fallow periods, let's say. So to get us thinking about this topic, I thought we could listen here to novelist Mirza Waheed.
Poetry. The purest form, they say, is poetry. While some novelists might argue theirs is the greatest form ever invented, it's poetry where you witness language at its finest. After all, we do reserve special praise for books that affect us with their poetic language and beauty. In our noisy world of instant news and views, with the senses sometimes under assault from an increasingly visual culture, it's poetry I turn to cleanse my mind. to re-establish the connection with the magic of words. Many years ago, I read some Frears and Lorca before embarking on a novel, and I remember feeling fresh, somehow full of wonder, as if I was writing a story for the first time. Poetry does that. It's especially true if life's other duties sometimes keep you away from writing. Reading a collection of poems might then be akin to a blood transfusion. Print and read.
So what's your response listening to that, Ella? How does it compare with your own experience?
I think reading to write is really important. And definitely when I'm in one of those fallow, doubtful periods, reading is really important. And it is poetry that really wakes me up in a way that no other kind of writing can. In terms of my writing routine, really boring, awful stuff like having to give my partner my Instagram password so that I can't go on there. And also sort of like hiding my phone.
So how does that work? If you give him your...
So he changes it so I can't log in.
Oh, I see. Right.
Sorry, that wasn't clear. I didn't just like, please have my Instagram. It's a collaborative process.
Activity.
So my phone has to be sort of removed from the equation now these days, which is awful, isn't it? But that's the...
So reading does feed into your process. Because I was wondering, listening to the extract, what poets should read. If novelists read poems, what do we read? But you, like you, I get fired up by other poems. And maybe non-fiction, so actually everything, not novels a bit, but the thing that really gets me excited, like you, is other poems, I think.
Yeah, poems or lectures by poets, actually.
Yes,
if I have one playing on YouTube by whoever, Anne Carson, Alice Oswald, I can, that will sort of spark something usually.
Yeah.
But in terms of actually writing, I wouldn't start the day reading. I would wake up at 4 or 5 a.m. and make myself, I know, you're making
that is the middle of the night,
morning.
You realise that?
Yeah, it's not something that, it's not pleasurable. It's not something I would do naturally. And but something about dragging myself away from the bed and almost like I've sort of wrestled my brain into submission.
It's sort of like tricking yourself in a way.
Yeah, or I think it's more violent than that, I think. I think I'm being really hard on myself. It feels physically sort of gross to be up for me, to be up at that time.
I hope you don't get dressed. I mean, or maybe that's prying a bit.
No. No, I was thinking like I'm definitely not naked, but I don't know if I will have put something on, and I have to sort of not really be awake enough to be thinking of my emails or my life. It just has to be me in the writing.
Yeah. So you in a state or at a stage before the day kind of rushes in and takes over. And I've also heard you say before that without a deadline and people to let down, you find it hard to power yourself to write. I'm imagining that you would still write, but maybe less would get finished.
Yeah. Compelled to write, definitely not compelled to finish. I really do need deadlines. I don't know if that's because I've trained myself through the various sort of poetry jobs I've had over the last decade.
To only,
yeah. That's how I've sort of made work. And that was, regular deadlines, quite intense deadlines every few months.
Wow.
And that, I don't know whether that's just meant that there's a particular pressure that I am used to feeling in order to sort of pull a poem or a piece of work over the line. But yeah, it's got really bad. I've sort of become highly masochistic in my writing practice. Like I sort of informed the publishers. I made sure that the work had a home, the book had a home before I finished it, so that I was writing into a space and into a deadline. And I sort of gently told the publishers that they needed to tell me that, people would die and my parents wouldn't love me anymore if I didn't finish. Like, it's got that bad.
Did they do that for you?
I got a really scary email on deadline day, which I think might have been real and not them just playing into it, but it said it's Monday or no book.
Whoa.
Yeah. But I don't know if that was because I'd asked them for it.
I don't think poets are used to that kind of...
I'm such a freak. I was like, yes.
Well, so it worked.
Yeah. I went surfing that morning and cut my head open. I had to have 7 stitches. And I think that might have been a sign that I was maybe pushing it
a bit too
bit
far.
too far.
I think
I wasn't
maybe.
in my head anymore, or in my body, rather.
Literally.
Yeah. Yeah. That was
See-
weird because I was watching people look inside my head. And I was like, yeah, on deadline day, that makes complete sense that I've been trying to look inside
So
my
I was
head.
going to say, do deadlines never frighten you? But obviously they do, and that's why they work.
Yeah, it's the good fear.
Yeah.
When I was trying to explain to someone in a pub the other day, I used a really awful metaphor of needing pressure to make a diamond. You know, that old one.
Yeah.
But I do think that it is that particular corner that I like to trap myself in, that I have to try and sort of work a way out of.
Yeah.
That
It
makes
makes
my
sense.
best work.
It does make sense.
Thank you.
It's very strange, but it makes sense.
I feel safe here.
No, it's not. It's not strange.
Are you a professional writer struggling with financial difficulties? The Royal Literary Fund is here to support you. At the RLF, we believe that every writer deserves the chance to thrive, no matter what life throws your way. We offer a variety of hardship grants tailored to help professional writers in need, whether it's short-term relief or ongoing support. Perhaps you're dealing with an unexpected expense, a drop in income, or facing challenges that make writing difficult, such as illness, disability, or now relying on your pension. If you're eligible, our grants team will walk you through our discreet and confidential application process, ensuring you receive the support you need. Visit rlf.org.uk to check your eligibility and inquire today. The Royal Literary Fund. We believe writers matter because writing matters.
Ella, I've been aware while reading Good Lord that there is a little part of me searching for Ella while I'm reading and wondering how much of you there is in the speaker's voice, which is crazy because I know that it's a pointless question when it comes to my own poetry. And also you seem to be deliberately playing with the reader on this point. So early on, for example, in the poem you say, my father was a swineherd, mother was a seer of sorts. Voice is complicated. So we're going to listen now to translator Adriana Hunter talking about voice.
Hearing voices. When I teach translation, there's an exercise I like to set my students. It's a short dialogue between a man called Robert and a woman called Émilie, who are arranging a party for someone called Florence. I divide my students into two groups and ask both groups to translate the same piece. There's one line in the dialogue that goes, "Oh mon Dieu, non, ce serait vraiment terrible pour Florence," which translates roughly as, "Oh my God, no, that would be really terrible for Florence." But one group usually translate it as something along the lines of, "Oh good heavens, no, that would be perfectly frightful for Florence," while the other group comes up with something like, "OMG, no, that would totally suck for Florence." This is because I give the groups different information on the context of the dialogue. Group 1 is told that they're working for a British publisher, and Robert and Emily are a retired Major General and his wife arranging his sister's 80th birthday party. Group 2 is told that they're working for a US publisher. Robert and Emily are both 18, and they're arranging his little sister's 16th birthday party. Context, then, is a key element to finding and establishing voice in translation. I always think of translation as being a perfect balance between science and art. It requires all the precision of a science to remain faithful to the letter of the source text, but all the creativity of an art to remain faithful to its spirit. You could say that context is the science part of finding voice. It's incontrovertible. Different people say things differently. In the example with the dialogue, my students are being steered not only by the character's age, but also by the context of the target language, the language into which they're translating. Of course, context in the source language is even more important. The more translators know about what frames a sentence, the easier it is for us to give the correct interpretations of words and voice. Let's take the French verb impressionner, which can very often be translated as to impress, but could also mean to stun, stagger, or overwhelm. You can be impressionné, impressed, by Emma Raducanu's performance in the 2021 US Open. But someone squeamish emerging from a Tarantino movie saying they were impressionné may not be commenting on the director's cinematographic achievements. They might be saying they were shaken or distressed. You'd need to know more about the person to be sure. So the voice emerges during the course of a translation as we become more familiar with the context. But to get back to that Robert and Emily dialogue, it takes more than context to come up with such radically different versions. The only instruction I give students with this exercise is to try to hear the voice. It's significant that I'm asking them to do something passive. We can choose to listen to something, but we can't control our hearing. I'm hoping my students will be open to signals in the text and receptive to the way they hear a particular voice. If context is the science behind establishing voice, this receptive ear is the art. The techniques can be learned, but some people have an innate ability. They have an ear for voice, as others have an ear for music.
So obviously, Adriana's talking specifically about voice in translation there, but she stresses the importance of context. She says context is the science part of finding voice at one point, and the receptive ear is the art, which I found really intriguing. She also says that some people have an ear for voice, and I would say that you are one of them, Ella. So I'm wondering about how context feeds into the voice of the characters who speak your poems.
In my normal poetic practice, as in not this recent book, I would say that it shifts, that each poem is its own world, that sometimes they're persona poems, and so versions of other voices. Sometimes they're really close to my own voice and my own experiences. But the fact that you don't have to stick, that it's not memoir, that it's not nonfiction, is sort of what I enjoy. And I think that contextually I'm happy to mess about a bit and sort of confuse that science that that we just heard about.
What do you think she meant by that? The context is the science part.
I guess, I mean, translation's amazing. I'm in awe of anyone who's a translator. It's like a magic trick, especially poetry.
Yeah.
My God, mon Dieu.
Oh, mon Dieu.
Oh, Florence. But I don't know what it would mean for outside of translation. And I guess you can stretch. I mean, in a way, I was translating experiences from my own life and my own sort of confusion or moments of emotional difficulty through this voice, into this voice.
Did that make it easier to write about those experiences?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of like the sort of practical writing, it was really difficult to write because of the rhythm. I would start every day by reading out what I had so far, and then would write like 4 lines. And
getting back into the rhythm.
And sort of by the end of it, I was reading 30,000 words out loud, and then getting to.
Oh, so you read every day?
Every
you read
time
the whole
I read
the start.
Everything. Yeah, so it's almost like I've never made puff pastry, but I understand it's a real arse-ache to fold in the butter every time and keep sort of folding in the butter. That was sort of what I was doing. I was folding it over itself again and again. But in terms of the content, and, you know, there are things in the book that are sort of more difficult, I guess, or more dark. That was much easier to write because she doesn't sound or think like me. There are things that she'll say that I would say, but on the whole, she's a sort of amplified, weirder, more sort of violent and dark version of some version of a version of me, some version of herself, I guess. And that you can just sort of pour things into that. And it became hungry, the voice. I would sort of have an experience that morning, and then in the evening I was writing it it was sort of being folded into the puff
She was
pastry.
saying, that's mine.
Yeah,
that's my
she was
experience.
grabbing it, which I've never had before. And then things begin to blur, don't they?
Yeah, they do blur, but that's fascinating. And it makes sense completely to me that you read from the start, because you need to get completely reabsorbed into that voice, don't you?
And it had to feel like one stream of consciousness email.
Had
to feel like she was just sort of letting it all out. And so it couldn't change. You know, we're not consistent daily. Our voice, our brains are full of different things. So I had to get back into it. And the only way I could think to do that would be to read from the beginning.
So you were aiming for a more consistent voice in her, well, because obviously the time frame's much shorter, she's just like a genius, sort of just blurted it all out in iambs. But our own moods, your mood as a writer would change. So you needed to fully engage back into that.
Yeah, and I didn't want there to be any breaks. I didn't want you to feel like you could put it down, like there was a moment where there was a chapter shift or anything. Everything had to sort of feed in to the same sort of momentum.
And what about the suggestion that Adriana makes to her students to hear the voices of their characters? I mean, I guess we're sort of talking about that. Does something similar happen to you? You said that she grabs your experiences, but do you hear her voice? Did you hear her voice?
Yeah, I started to hear iambs when people were talking.
Yeah.
Have you ever had that happen to you?
Yeah, I had that the other day. Horrible. Maybe after reading your book, actually. It is horrible. It's the worst kind of earworm.
Because you do realise that very occasionally you're talking to someone, they accidentally do a perfect iambic pentameter.
Not that unusual, actually.
No, or maybe this the people I hang out with happens less.
All my friends talking perfect iambic pentameters. Who are you hanging out with, Ella?
Mostly tradesmen. My partner's a builder. So, and that's weird because you're not behaving socially normally because you're sort of tuning into something that you're not supposed to be tuning into with conversation.
Yeah.
And I also found like with her voice, like when you get car sick and it takes you a while, even when you've stopped moving, to get over the sort of nausea, it would take a while for me to stop thinking with her voice or her perspective.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Because it's quite angry, it gets angrier and angrier through the book in a funny way, but also in a slightly unhinged way. I was spending time with my in-laws. We were on holiday together and I had to really be careful not to allow her to be sort of governing breakfast.
I can imagine that might be tricky, especially with in-laws.
Sorry. A couple of weeks ago, I was in Istanbul for a poetry festival, and there was a Balkan theme. So there were lots of poets, mostly men in their 60s with big moustaches, from like Azerbaijan, Turkey, Greece, Moldova, Macedonia. And there was this dinner where everyone had to sort of put forth an idea about where poetry comes from. And someone said poetry is epiphany, and somebody else said, no, poetry is experience, which I felt it was like I'd been dropped in some sort of art house film. But I said poetry is absorbency, because I understand the sort of epiphany idea and the experience idea. But for me, a big part of my writing is being sort of porous and allowing sort of life to and experiences to sort of sink in, and that's the sort of main part actually, is being awake to the oddness of human existence rather than the actual sort of like finding the muse or whatever. It's already sort of sunk in by that point.
Yeah, the everyday is strange, right? So it's just
really strange.
Being aware, being attuned to that. I'm very jealous of Istanbul because I love it. It has a special place in my heart.
It was a really beautiful. I mean, I'd never been before, but what a city! What poets!
What poets! Yeah. So I think writing in the voice of a specific persona seems to, for me, to make the writing easier. But going back to the idea of fallow periods, writer's block, when things aren't going so well, I can feel a bit of a fraud, a bit angsty, So we're going to listen finally to Ian Thompson telling Gabriel Badamosi about being able to show his children evidence of a real job.
When we return to the idea of writing as a life raft, has it saved you? Where has it taken you in your life? Are you floating rudderless?
Well, a lot of the time it does feel like that. And I must say, when I got my job with the Royal Literary Fund as a fellow, it was very important for me to show my children my office, which was on Gower Street, because I think almost until that point, and we're talking maybe here 8-9 years ago, they thought I didn't have a job.
Oh, Daddy's got a real job.
It's a real job. And there was a whiteboard there with magic marker, and my two sons wrote various weird things on the board, which were left there, I remember, for the student I was seeing the day after. She was perplexed by these comments. But anyway, it was an important moment for me, and I think for my children. There was always a sensation I still have of writing into the void. You write and write and write, and actually you get very little feedback. Mm-hmm. You wait for a review often, or quite often it's not what you want to read about the book you've written. But I honestly don't know what else I could do.
So it's a sort of hailing out into the mist, the fog, a sort of sea of unknowing.
Yeah.
This is the quality that you experience as a writer. It's the need and it's the quality of your experience.
Yes, absolutely.
So did anything resonate there for you in particular, Ella?
Well, there was a phrase by the person asking the questions. Is it a case of hailing out into the mist? Or something like that?
Very poetic.
Yeah. And I thought, is that a phrase from something? I Googled it and I couldn't find anything. So I guess that's just the sort of atmospheric, what he was thinking it must feel like. But that makes sense to me. If it's a question of sort of calling out through some sort of unknown, the idea that you might have an office and go in every day and that there's something that you have a sort of to-do list creatively and you sort of check that off. I think there is maybe an element of that at some point in writing, but mostly you just have no idea when you sit down at your desk what you're going to be doing.
Writing into void, aren't you? As Ian described. Yeah, no, I can definitely relate to that. It's a scary thing, writing and not getting the feedback. And I suppose having a job is a way of making that less scary or giving you some sense of identity. But you've done all kinds of residencies and projects.
Loads.
So what is your general take on writing as work?
Yeah, there's something really interesting that was said in that clip about the office, having the office and feeling real. And I think that I'm a poet who's had many lanyards. And that's always made me feel like I'm actually doing something. When you asked earlier about whether I'm honest at sort of parties and things about being a poet, because I've had many lanyards that say poet in residence or poet.
You kind of had to be.
I feel like, I've had to sort of stand. And, I had a residency at Dartington in Devon, which is this beautiful, it used to be a radical art school, gorgeous gardens with topiary. And there would be visitors wandering around. And because I had a lanyard on, they would stop me to ask questions about, the tilt yard or directions to somewhere.
Oh, yeah.
I'd have to say, oh, sorry, no, poet.
Yeah. No, you're fine.
A poet. Shameful.
Oh, I wish I'd had that because I had a residency at the V&A and was forever. I tried to hide my lanyard in my jumper or my shirt or something because people would ask me directions. I had no idea. So maybe always wear a badge saying poet and you'll be excused from all kinds of things.
Yeah, never have to give directions again. Who wants directions from a poet? But in terms of the work of writing, I have a weird relationship with it because I think it's close to some sort of kind of patronage and like in an old school way.
Yes, yeah.
If you're living precariously, trying to make a living as an artist or a writer, and you get offered a chunk of money and sort of space and time to write about something particular, like a garden or an exhibition or a river or whatever it is, moss or a spacecraft, all of which I've done, public bus route, then, you get there and you think, God, what a dream. I'm being paid to write, which is what I want to do. I get to sort of experience this new thing, this new place, talk to people. But actually, there's also alongside that a really particular loneliness that's very acute because you're in a new environment and you're having to experience it, but not experience it neutrally and sort of openly, but experience it with a view to writing about it.
There's a certain pressure there as well.
Real pressure.
Yeah.
And also this idea that you're only having access to this sort of incredible beauty or spot of interest because of your sort of artistic whatever you're going to make, and that feels weird because then you start to feel like a fraud because you think like, well, if I don't produce, then I never get to see this river again, or
I know that's a very normal feeling. Yeah. So, do you have any new exotic residencies or projects lined up that I need to be jealous of?
I'm doing a bit of writing for Exeter University at the moment to do with how elections and climate crisis sort of are overlapping as the sort of where those two things intersect.
Wow. In poetry?
I will be looking at it poetically, but they've just had a conference in Penryn in Cornwall on the Exeter campus about elections and climate. And that's, one of those things where I'm about to dive into quite a lot of, I don't want to say dense because I'm sure it's enjoyable as well, but heavy research papers and presentations, and then have to find some way to express that feels authentic to me, but also sort of nuanced and without agenda, because I think poetry should maybe sort of never have an agenda in a straightforward sense, at least.
I think that is a brilliant note on which to end, that poetry shouldn't have an agenda, and there you are, poised to dive. I'm very excited to see what comes next. And Ella, thank you so much. It really has been a treat to talk to you.
You've been listening to Collected, the podcast about writing from the Royal Literary Fund. If you'd like to share any comments or questions, please use the hashtag RLFcollected on our social media channels. The music was composed by Andy Glenn. There was research by Nicola Baldwin and post-production by James Robertson. Our producer was Anne Morgan.